Good afternoon, Robert Scribbler. It is August 8th, 2018. Thank you for joining me for another climate change and clean energy video blog. Now for this segment, I am going to discuss the persistent weather pattern across the U.S. That is the persistent extreme heat, wildfires, and drought across the U.S. West, and the persistent trough pattern across the U.S. East and central U.S., providing extreme rainfall and various extreme thunderstorm events. So we've seen this pattern since at least late June, and it's a pattern that's been settling in for week after week that has brought some extraordinary events, particularly for the U.S. West, but also a number of extreme storm and rainfall events for the U.S. East. Looking ahead to the next 10 days, it appears that this pattern will continue to persist with a few nuances. This satellite image provided by the National Hurricane Center does give us an overall idea of the storms that continue to fire throughout the east and the fires that continue to burn throughout the west. In addition, we can see hurricane or tropical cyclone John here, which may provide a bit of moisture in through the southern central U.S. and possibly in the Arizona and New Mexico region over the coming days as fronts continue to drop down and potentially tap some of this moisture from this tropical flow. Now, looking at the jet stream map for today, we see that the ridge pattern over the U.S. West continues. This as sea ice recedes through the Beaufort Sea and as very warm surface temperatures across the eastern Pacific continue to enhance this ridge feature. Meanwhile, the trough feature continues to persist across the U.S. East as a cool pool east of Greenland, somewhat cooler than normal waters in Baffin and Hudson Bay tend to aid in the development of this trough feature. I'm going to talk about this a bit more, but before I do, I'm going to look at predicted temperatures for the U.S. I'm just going to go ahead and run this GFS model forecast for you. And as we can see, temperatures, particularly across the U.S. West, remain very hot, running up into the 100s and 90s up throughout the U.S. West. Now this pattern begins to shift east as we enter Saturday, with a potential for 100-degree readings at the Canada-US border. Note that a trough begins to dig in over the U.S. East into early to middle of next week as very hot conditions reassert for the U.S. West. Now these very hot conditions are helping to fan wildfires across the U.S. and increase drought conditions, while the trough in the east is expected to bring continued potential for extreme rainfall, particularly in thunderstorm events. I'm running this model a couple of times so you can see the very extreme temperatures across the U.S. West. I'm just going to reverse this a bit to focus in on Saturday, where we see Montana, the Dakotas, and Canada with the potential for temperatures well above 100 degrees, which is quite extraordinary. I'm just going to go ahead and flip this to an anomaly map so that you can see how much warmer than normal this burst of heat into the northern U.S., north-central U.S. tier and into southern Canada is, with temperatures in Fahrenheit ranging from between 15 and up to close to 30 degrees above average in this burst of heat. I'm just going to go ahead and move this model for you so that you can see that overall temperatures across the U.S. west tend to remain above normal to much above normal throughout the period, and temperatures in the east tend to fluctuate between cooler than normal and warmer than normal ahead of the fronts. Also note the extreme pulse of heat moving in through southern Canada. Now, looking at precipitation, the U.S. Drought Monitor indicates that the West remains gripped in drought, particularly in the Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado region. But looking ahead, we find that some moisture is expected to invade into New Mexico and Arizona as part of a monsoonal flow, possibly from moisture bleeding off of a tropical cyclone John, but also particularly bleeding into Texas, with the U.S. East seeing a continued potential for severe rainfall to very severe rainfall. This Texas region is sandwiched between the ridge zone in the west and the trough zone in the east, and so according to this NOAA map, it looks like we might see some rather extreme thunderstorms firing over the coming week over this region, so something to keep an eye on. Now, looking at some of the climate change related features associated with this extreme weather pattern, we see that the northern and eastern Pacific remains very warm, and this warmth tends to aid the formation of strong ridge patterns, which have facilitated extreme heat in the U.S. West and extreme wildfires in the U.S. West. And this feature is ongoing, similar to a feature that we saw in 2014. And it's notable that some forecasters are looking at the potential for a mid-ocean El Nino type event come later this year. And this kind of feature and tendency also during 2014 aided in the prevalence of much warmer than normal sea surface temperatures in the Northeast Pacific. So this feature appears to be similar, and that was a feature that was also associated with what is known as ridiculously resilient ridge patterns throughout the U.S. West. So we're just going to have to keep an eye on this to see if we see a similar long-term persistence of ridge patterns for the U.S. West. We certainly have over the past few weeks. It's also notable that we have sea ice recession in the Beaufort Sea, which also tends to pull the ridge patterns northward. As I mentioned before, we have seen a persistent cool pool in the North Atlantic, cooler than normal sea surfaces in Baffin and parts of Hudson Bay, which have tended to aid in the facing trough pattern deepening through the U.S. East. It's also notable that sea surface temperatures off the U.S. East Coast have warmed up quite a bit over recent days, and this warming off the U.S. East Coast may aid in the development of severe weather by providing added moisture through the region. Also, might provide a kick for warming that does occur in between the various frontal systems that do develop. So just a basic update of the forecast, which shows continuing severe heat for the U.S. West and potential for severe storms in the U.S. East and the central U.S. Thank you for joining me, and I'll be chatting with you soon.